Recently I covered Mighty Number 9, a video game that was funded predominantly from the crowdfunding website Kickstarter and managed to raise over $4 million. However, upon its release in 2016, it was a critical and commercial failure that disappointed many, myself included. But today we're shifting gears slightly. We're talking about Freedom Planet, a game that managed to raise a far lower amount of money from Kickstarter and had a team behind it that didn't exactly have a lot of experience with the video game industry. And yet, upon its release in 2014, it went on to be a modern cult classic. Today we aren't merely talking about how Freedom Planet found unexpected success, nor are we critiquing the Kickstarter platform, or merely just talking about its original mastermind, Steven DiDuro. Instead, through research, interviews, and analysis, we're going to be going over the full development story of Freedom Planet. This isn't so much the art of failure, but I guess this is kind of the art of success. What is an indie game? Most would define it as a video game, most often created by a small development team or even a single person, which is published independently of a traditional video game publisher. These titles are often marked by having a more basic presentation style than a big budget title would. They often even serve as references to older styles or eras of gaming. And in every sense of the word, Freedom Planet is thus an indie game. The story of Freedom Planet technically begins in 2011 in Denmark with Steven DiDuro, aka Strife. DiDuro had moved to Denmark from the United States some years earlier for personal reasons and was living a fairly normal life. Living in the suburban area of Herlev, close to the city of Copenhagen, he found himself working a menial day job while he worked on video games as a hobby. These were often just small projects that he'd distribute to his friends. But this all changed in 2011 when he decided to make a fan game based off Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog series. DiDuro had become a fan of the Sonic series at a young age. In the 90s, his family had gotten a Sega Genesis console, allowing him to experience titles such as Sonic the Hedgehog, of course, but also the likes of Gunstar Heroes from a young age. Granted, this was usually in the role of a player too, as in true childhood gaming fashion, his older brother usually had dibs on being player one. It should then be no surprise that DiDuro's earliest memories of playing Sonic weren't actually in regards to playing as the speedy blue hedgehog himself, but rather as his sidekick, Tails. In the early to mid-2000s, two major developments would then occur in DiDuro's life that would shape his future career. The first was getting a copy of ClickTeam's Click and Play software, which was a very basic video game development tool. The second was joining the Sonic Retro community, which is an online Sonic fan forum and wiki known for its extensive sub-communities focused around Sonic ROM hacking and fan game creation. From this fan-run website would come several now lauded individuals, including Christian Whitehead and Simon Tomley, who would later go on to help create the official Sonic Mania for Sonic IP owner Sega. Also active in this community at the time was Leila Wilson, who was cutting her teeth creating musics for projects such as Sonic Megamix version 5, which was being headed by Tomley. It was also during this time that DiDuro's interest in game development would truly flourish.
When you're first starting with game development, you kind of gravitate towards the games that you like and already know, and you kind of like experiment with those games' formulas when you're first starting out. And obviously, like I started out with like Mega Man and Sonic and Mario, like just kind of like building similar platform games to that. And that led me to the Sonic community. I started using the Multimedia Fusion line of products when I was 11 years old. I started with a program called Click and Play. My parents ordered it for me from Europe, but I was exposed to it by like one of those cheap CDs that you get from the supermarket with like thousands of games on it. And some of the games on there happened to be made with Click and Play. So after I got that, I started playing around with that for a few years, just like making games by myself that like I didn't really like show anyone. And then like I started making some freeware games, and then I started dabbling around with like more sophisticated physics engines, like the kind that Sonic uses.
And around 2011 then, after being surrounded by those making their own fan-made Sonic games for years, DiDuro decided he himself was going to try his hand at making a Sonic the Hedgehog fan game. The scope of this project would soon grow to a point where it would be a properly released PC fan game. Though the main character of this title was not actually intended to be Sonic the Hedgehog himself, the game did rely on a physics engine similar to that found in the Sonic game, and included Sonic-like elements such as rings, loop-de-loops, and nefarious Dr. Eggman as the big bad. However, as DiDuro continued to work on this project, friends of his began to mention to him the increasing amounts of time and effort being sunk into this game's development. And this was in addition to working a day job. Eventually, he was convinced that, instead of continuing on creating a Sonic fan project, he would axe this original idea, instead redevelop this game into a truly original game that he could sell without any worries about it being taken down by Sega. This was the birth of Freedom Planet.
When I was working on Freedom Planet, it was just going to be like a small little flash game project. But that was around the time that Kickstarter was at its peak for video games, and some friends of mine convinced me to make just a few changes to what I was working on in order to make it an original title.
Instead of Sonic the Hedgehog, this game would feature its own original character, Sash Lilac. Lilac was not a character of DiDuro's design. Instead, she was the creation of artist Xiao Ling, who gave DiDuro permission to use her for this game. However, some critiques were raised by those who saw early versions of the game, most notably about Lilac being nothing more than just a purple Sonic clone. Indeed, there were concerns at this point about the game in general having no identity other than a new classic Sonic game. Thus, for many aspects of Freedom Planet at this early stage, DiDuro already found himself back at the drawing board. However, he would begin operating under the name of GalaxyTrail, which he intended to make his own game studio. It was then decided that the game would have to go through an even further overhaul. Though it would still use the same Sonic-esque engine, gameplay would no longer feature aspects such as the rings, though it would have its own collectibles, and at some point Lilac's design was retooled from a hedgehog into a humanoid dragon, and her own gameplay too was tweaked to less resemble that of Sonic. In addition, 2 new characters also designed by Xiao Ling were added: Carol, a wildcat, and Milla, a hush basset. A new villain was also decided upon. This would be Lord Brevin, an alien overlord who had his heart set on intergalactic conquest. Brevin, however, was not originally designed with Freedom Planet in mind. In fact, his design had been created by DiDuro some years prior, and though he had grown fond of the design, he unfortunately never found a chance up to this point to use it. The game would also begin to incorporate influence from other non-Sonic titles. This is evident in the final game through references to and stage designs that evoke feelings of Gunstar Heroes, Alien Soldier, and Mega Man X. Finally, there came the issue of funding. DiDuro had never worked on a game intended to be released for sale before. The scope here was also much bigger than anything he'd worked on prior, and as such, he would need funding to release it on a platform such as, say, Steam for PCs. In addition, though he could handle much of the programming work himself, he would need help with aspects of game development such as pixel art and scoring a soundtrack. For the latter of these, he ultimately decided to have the game's music partially handled by himself and composers Shane Ellis and Leila Wilson, the latter of whom he had begun working with on the recommendations of Simon Tomley.
Yeah, that soundtrack it never stops. It's just pumping the whole time. It's like firing on all cylinders. It's like a drag race, just explosively fast. Well, I knew stealth, but when I worked on Megamix, that was back when it was just Tweaker doing it, and we talked a lot, and he ended up really liking my music. I really liked his, so he was like, hey, do you want to do some stuff for this? And that was how those first tracks ended up in there.
As DiDuro had never worked on a game such as this at this scale before, he set the initial funding bar low. He figured he could partially finance it himself through money he earned from working his day job, and then earn the rest of the money needed through the crowdfunding website Kickstarter. Thus, towards the end of 2012, he and a few others began planning the Freedom Planet Kickstarter campaign. They made a list of expenses and tried their best to find reasonable stretch goals, and hoped that the game itself would initially be promoted through word of mouth. Leading up to the Kickstarter campaign's launch, he also gauged interest and searched for feedback from various online communities, most notably the Sonic Retro forums. Ultimately, Freedom Planet had an initial funding goal of only $2,000, a paltry amount compared to other later campaigns. Though Freedom Planet was being created at the height of the boom in retro gaming-inspired indie titles, other Kickstarter campaigns launched later in 2013, such as Shovel Knight and Mighty No. 9, would have funding goals of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And in the latter of those games' cases, teams of experienced game development professionals behind them. In the case of Freedom Planet, however, it wasn't just a question of if this game could get enough support to be funded, but if DiDuro and those involved, because of their lack of experience, had it in them to create a game that was not only good, but could sell well. But then, on the 15th of January 2013, the Freedom Planet Kickstarter campaign was launched. It was now or never, and the fate of the project now lay firmly in the hands of strangers on the internet. On the 14th of February 2013, the Freedom Planet campaign ended on Kickstarter. After 1 month, the project had been promoted by several YouTubers and some media outlets, and had managed to smash through its original $2,000 funding goal, ultimately reaching over $25,000. Pitched as a mashup between Sonic the Hedgehog, Mega Man, and Gunstar Heroes, interest was piqued in those who felt nostalgia towards the video games of the early and mid-1990s. Within a few hours, it had hit 25% of its funding goal. Then, the very next day, it surpassed its original goal, guaranteeing that GalaxyTrail would receive funding. Whether those involved were prepared for the work ahead or not, it seemed that Freedom Planet was actually going to get made. By the end of the campaign, a relatively staggering amount had been raised. DiDuro was amazed by the success here, though work was ultimately just getting started. Due to how far it had beat the original funding goal, Freedom Planet had managed to earn a variety of stretch goals, perks which were meant to incentivize people to continue to back the game after it achieved its original desired funding amount. These include promises of hiring extra programmers, a webcomic that would follow the plot of the game, animated voice-acted cutscenes, and even 2 additional playable characters in the form of the ninja-like Spade and the alien Torque, which would bring the overall character count to 5. It was also during this time that the overall story of the game would begin to resemble its final form. In the final release, it would go as follows. Our 3 main heroines, Leila, Carol, and Mila, live on the futuristic planet of Avalis, which is divided into 3 countries, Shuigong, Shangmu, and Shangtu. The world is heavily influenced by various Eastern Asian cultures and is very technologically advanced. The nearly limitless power source for the world is supplied by the Kingdom Stone, a mystical relic of supposed unimaginable power. However, soon the planet is invaded by the army of the intergalactic warlord, Lord Brevin, who kills the king of Shuigong, assumes control of that country, and sets his bloodthirsty sights towards stealing the Kingdom Stone. At the same time, the alien Torque crash lands on the planet and, disguising himself as a duck turtle thing, meets up with our heroines and tells them of Brevin's plans. Thus, they all set off to save the world from Lord Brevin, all the while getting entangled in diplomatic squabbles that ultimately result in them going through a wide variety of platforming stages. To put it simply, though darker than your average Sonic game, especially as it ultimately had moments such as torture scenes in it, it is ultimately a classic 2D platform plot that serves the purpose of giving players an excuse to go through a variety of levels. The game would also differentiate itself from Sonic games further through its gameplay. Despite still having a physics engine in some stages that resembled those of a classic Sonic game, each of the 3 main characters was noticeably more combat-based than any of the classic Sonic characters were. The game had hit all but one of its planned Kickstarter stretch goals, and was promised to have fully animated cutscenes done in the same Sega Genesis-esque art style as the rest of the game. This was due to DiDuro feeling that such a thing had not really been done in a game quite like this before. A development team was assembled featuring people from around the world. Though DiDuro himself was in Denmark at this time, the bulk of the Freedom Planet team was located in the United States, with several other members in Canada, various European nations, and of course Yao Ling, who created the original designs for the game's protagonist, who is located in China. Updates went out to Kickstarter backers at a fairly regular pace as progress in the game began to ramp up. These range from gameplay showcases to updates and rewards and even interviews with the developers. Of note, early on the 1st of February 2013, DiDuro was interviewed for Kickstarter's official podcast. Also during the first weeks of the campaign, a page was created on Steam Greenlight, where people could publicly follow progress and play beta releases of Freedom Planet. This version of the game itself was also promised to anyone who had backed at least 10 USD to the campaign. And thus we find ourselves back on the 14th of February. The same day that the campaign ended, additional funding options were opened up via PayPal for those who had wished to back the game but had missed out on the Kickstarter campaign. The future seemed bright, and the game was set to be released in May of 2014. One thing that marked the Freedom Planet campaign from many other games financed through Kickstarter is the attempts made to be transparent with how funds earned would be spent. This included a full breakdown in the game's main Kickstarter page, which went so far as to even account for the cut that Kickstarter itself would take when the game was funded. In addition, DiDuro felt a moral obligation to point out any changes in where funds were allocated whenever he could. Then, over the following months, work continued steadily. Pixel art was created, stages were programmed, music was composed. On the surface, all seemed well, but tensions did get heated at some points. Though not counting voice actors, the GalaxyTrail team would grow to encompass several people. Freedom Planet was very much so DiDuro's baby. He did the bulk of the programming work and even dabbled in other areas of the development, such as the soundtrack, and on occasion would butt heads on aspects of the game not handled by himself, such as is the case with a couple of tracks created by Wilson. Most problematic of these was the theme for Sky Battalion, a stage which DiDuro and Wilson went back and forth on for weeks. She would later say of this, "We fought that song like a god-dang dragon." Two things made Freedom Planet stand out from other popular retro throwback titles of the time. The first alpha build of the game was made available to backers before funding even ended, and though reportedly quite fun, was also a bit rough. At this point, the graphics weren't nearly as detailed as in the final release, and in the earliest of alphas, the game also apparently only ran the 4:3 aspect ratio, such as found on an old CRT television. However, by the 15th of May 2013, when alpha version 1.4.1 was released, most of this had been updated, and the game felt smoother and even ran a more proper modern 16:9 aspect ratio. Then, barely a month later, a demo of the game featuring the Sky Battalion stage was released, and it seemed that progress was indeed continuing at a very steady rate. Another push for promotion also began around this time. In the same post to the Kickstarter page in which the June Sky Battalion demo was released, a call was made to backers to potentially get the demo version of the game into the hands of gaming websites and YouTube personalities so as to raise awareness of the project. DiDuro also began toying around with the idea of potentially porting the game to a home console after the initial release. Then, in November of that year, Freedom Planet would be announced for its first major showcase at a video game convention. This would be at the Indie Game Mega Booth at PAX East 2014 in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the most notable gaming conventions on the North American East Coast. To quote DiDuro, "It was an unforgettable experience." However, though close tabs was being kept on the budget and no new development team members were being brought on only as needed, DiDuro still did a majority of the programming work himself. While he worked seemingly non-stop on the game at times, remarking that he gave up much of his social life while working on it, he also found himself becoming a bit of a workaholic. Particularly while working on some of the game's bosses, especially the larger and more complex of these bosses, he would find himself getting stressed out with certain things that he was trying to program. Ultimately, the stress would build and build until finally he would have to step back from what he was working on. However, instead of actually taking a break from working on the game, he would take a break of sorts by temporarily directing his attention to other aspects of the game.
It's really interesting because sometimes when I'm struggling with building something in a game and I need time to figure out what to do next, my idea of taking a break is to kind of work on something completely inconsequential to the game itself. that's the reason that you can sit down on the benches on some of the stages. Like, that was just something that I coded while I was working on like the boss fight for that stage. I think like I was taking a break from it because it was taking me a while, so I ended up coding benches. But out of one of those like programmer's blocks, I would say, I ended up coming up with this idea for a motorcycle that Carol could ride.
Work would continue throughout the holidays of 2013 and into the start of 2014. Towards the beginning of that year, a proper release date was even announced, the 30th of May, 2014. Yet, by this point, some decisions were made at GalaxyTrail in regards to some of the Kickstarter promises. Most notably, the 2 promised additional playable characters, though still appearing in the game's story mode and cutscenes, and though partially playable at this point, they would not make their way into the final game.
My biggest worry is if the game would do well enough that I would be able to uphold all my obligations to the backers of our Kickstarter, because we had a few stretch goals that we were having difficulties with. One of the stretch goals we had was to make kind of like a webcomic series to expand on the events of the game, and that didn't end up working out, so we communicated with the fans about it and said that we wanted to use that money to improve the pixel art in the game instead, and thankfully they were very understanding about that. And a couple of our other stretch goals involved adding new characters, and we got as far as getting them into kind of like beta testing, but by that point we were pushing the multimedia fusion engine to its absolute limits, and we were basically like having difficulties inserting them into levels that were designed for the main 3 characters instead of them. So at some point I would like to maybe make a spin-off game that involves those characters, just so they at least like have something.
Some other major changes were also decided during this time by DiDuro, both in regards to the game itself and his personal life. Around this time, he would move from Denmark to central New York, so as to be closer to family and the majority of those working on the game. In addition, some levels were also cut at this point, most notably the Warp Sector and the Horizon Starport stages, which were supposed to be exclusive to the character Torque. However, though Torque was scrapped as a playable character along with these stages, remnants of them are still within the data of the final release. However, while some content was being cut, other aspects of the game were being expanded on. For example, Final Dreadnought, the last level of the game, would extend into a multi-stage long gauntlet. Also, despite moving back to the United States, the majority of the game's team still worked remotely, and indeed several team members didn't even meet DiDuro in person until after Freedom Planet's final release. As the announced release date approached, all seemed well on the outside. Updates continued consistently on the Kickstarter page, with both private betas and public demos being released. The game began to be covered by more and more press outlets and was even featured on the cover of the May 2014 issue of Indie Game magazine. Backers were even being well communicated with about the game and their rewards. So it came as a shock to many when the game faced the first of several delays on the 5th of May 2014. Announced via the Kickstarter page, the game was to be moved back 1 month on Steam, from the 30th of May to the 30th of June. But then, on the 20th of June, the release date was pushed back again to the 19th of July. So what happened? Well, the animated cutscenes are what happened. The bulk of them weren't even started on till the final months of development, and working on them nearly wrecked DiDuro in the process. Indeed, supposedly the game itself wasn't even fully complete to his satisfaction until days before release. While many video games experience a Hell Week or Hell Weeks as a form of crunch time prior to launch, that bit of summer before the Freedom Planet launch has been referred to by some involved as the Hell Months.
He didn't do the cutscenes until the very end of the game's development. He had 2 weeks. He'd already pushed it back twice, and he was in the dev chat. He's like, guys, I don't think I can do this. And we're like, you can because you have to. And we were there, like, giving him moral support, but just that about killed it.
So I had to try and like rig together a system, and it ended up like hard coding a lot of the positioning of the characters and stuff. So that makes it difficult to go back and fix bugs in the cutscenes and stuff. But I thankfully I had some help during that final stretch. And then I think we made the final stage is actually 4 stages in one, and I think we ended up making up all of those in the last couple of months as well. Like between the graphics, like we were crazy productive.
For better or worse though, and perhaps at the expense of his own mental health, DiDuro was determined to have the game launch within the summer of 2014. One last demo was released on the 24th of June, and then, barring one final delay to the game, this time by only a few days caused by Steam not wanting new releases to be released on weekends, on the 21st of July 2014, Freedom Planet, the final game, was finally released to the world. Whether the game would be the retro throwback that DiDuro had hoped for, and whether the blood, sweat, and tears put into the project by those involved with GalaxyTrail would pay off, only time would tell.
A crisis has befallen our world. For centuries we have depended on the Kingdom Stone, but its strength is fading. Tensions are growing, and I fear that war may be inevitable.
This was the launch trailer for Freedom Planet. Shared out across the internet by backers, Sonic fans, and retro gaming enthusiasts alike, the game seemed to quickly gain steam, ultimately culminating in a release that was remarkably quiet. That's not to say that Freedom Planet was poorly received though. Far from it actually. Brad Jones of Game Rant would say of the game,
"All in all, Freedom Planet is a game that deserves to be mentioned among titles like the excellent Shovel Knight. It's rooted in the history of video games, but developed with an appreciation for the fact times have changed since the classics of the retro era had their day. Whether it's the engrossing gameplay, endearing character designs, or lighthearted plot, Freedom Planet will likely offer something that puts a smile on your face. Plus, it's probably the best Sonic game we're likely to receive for the foreseeable future."
While Richard Nake of GameCritics.com would award the game a perfect 10 out of 10 score, stating at the end of his review,
"The most impressive thing about Freedom Planet is just how good it feels. It feels great to find the correct sequence of actions to send Lilac rocketing through a level at warp speed. It feels great hearing each song on the excellent soundtrack for the first time. It feels great to nail the perfect spin dash on an enemy and absolutely shred it. That type of exhilaration is rare and worthy of praise. There's no shortage of retro-style games that will charm one's socks off with beautiful sprites and catchy tunes, but to combine all of that with such a deep mechanical understanding of those old Genesis platformers is a remarkable feat. GalaxyTrail, please take a bow."
However, though critics' scores were positive, what ultimately led to Freedom Planet gaining traction was word of mouth over the next year, and eventually uptake from YouTubers such as Some Call Me Johnny and My Life in Gaming.
To say that I enjoyed Freedom Planet would be an understatement. It truly felt like I discovered a long-lost Saturn game that just so happened to appeal to a bunch of things that makes me love games the way that I do. Maybe I'm being overdramatic, but it simply clicked with me in a way that not a lot of games do these days. And that's going to keep me coming back for a long time to come.
Due to positive word getting around, sales did eventually pick up. However, the game was not without faults. Many critics noted that the cutscenes often went on longer than expected for a game such as this, and that the overall tone and pacing for the story was all over the place. These were faults acknowledged by DiDuro, who lamented on not having spent more time on crafting the cutscenes. In addition, some critics felt that the game relied too much on being based upon Sega Genesis-style platformers, and that this held back its own identity. These gripes, among others, led to DiDuro around this time to begin to plan a sequel game. However, he wasn't quite done with this first game yet. In early 2015, GalaxyTrail would make an appearance at the PAX South Expo in San Antonio, Texas. Like any incarnation of the Penny Arcade Expo, this is considered one of the go-to events for those in or interested in the video game industry, and indeed has since been considered by DiDuro as one of the first major pushes for the title. It was also around this time that DiDuro decided to pursue one of his lifelong dreams. He had always wanted to have a game on a Nintendo platform. Thus, he began searching into how to accomplish such a feat, and remarkably, it was a fairly easy process, involving him contacting a few Nintendo representatives he found through their website. Thus, on the 9th of March 2015, it was announced that later that same year, Freedom Planet would be coming to the Nintendo Wii U.
That was around the time that the Wii U was starting to pick up steam, and even though obviously it never got to the same height as the Wii before it was I still saw kind of an opportunity to bring it to like a whole new audience who wasn't into PC gaming or Steam or anything like that. And the other thing is that like it had been a lifelong dream of mine to have a game on a Nintendo console So like just the fact that Nintendo at that time was starting to cater more towards indie developers, like with their Nindies program. I saw that as an opportunity to realize my dream, and I'm just really thrilled at like how open they were towards us and like how much they helped us out with like marketing and everything. So I'm really thankful for Nintendo for making that a reality.
The Wii U may seem like an odd choice to some, as that system itself was a massive flop for Nintendo, and that was quite evident through sales numbers by 2015. However, despite the stagnant sales of the Wii U, Nintendo began to become increasingly open to independent developers. Thus, while major third-party game developers avoid Nintendo's console like the plague, for indie developers such as GalaxyTrail, it seemed like a perfect fit for their title. After being given a small push by Nintendo themselves during the E3 Expo in 2015, mainly in the forms of a trailer for the game and a free demo via the eShop service, the game was released in early October that year, once again to acclaim. By 2016, the Wii U and Steam versions of Freedom Planet had together sold over 250,000 copies. With the success of the Wii U port, DiDuro then turned his sights to another console, one which had sold much better than Nintendo's machine, the Sony PlayStation 4. Getting a game published there, however, was easier said than done. DiDuro had hoped that this version would release sometime in 2016, but after his initial experiences with Sony, he began to wonder if this would ever get released at all. Sony was much more difficult to deal with than Nintendo, and their process was vastly different. Sony had a quality assurance system that seemed crazy and hard to pass, and made actually having a publisher seem near essential. Indeed, Freedom Planet had to go through Sony's quality assurance system 4 different times before it was allowed onto the PlayStation Network store. In comparison, when the game was later brought out into PS4 in Japan, due to that version being handled by Xseed, an established video game publisher, it only had to go through Sony's systems once. While Freedom Planet was making its initial rounds through Sony's QA testing, attempts were also being made to bring it to the Nintendo 3DS handheld. The game's engine was successfully ported, however, it seemed nearly impossible to get to run at any speed above a sluggish crawl. But then, after the announcement of the 3DS's successor, the Nintendo Switch, in late 2016, this version of the game was altogether abandoned. Finally, in March 2017, after an arduous wait, Freedom Planet would make its way onto the PlayStation 4. A year later, in August 2018, it would find its way onto the Nintendo Switch. The game would find steady sales and even gain a cult following, and is now considered by many to be a modern classic. Freedom Planet's creators didn't set out to change the world, but they did set out to create an homage to gaming in the 90s, and then fill said homage with their own characters and flair. Against all odds and a lack of experience in the gaming industry that to many would have spelled failure and doom from the very start, they found resounding success. The story of Freedom Planet is a story of a game that many thought would not succeed, that ultimately did become a successful cult classic. However, whether Freedom Planet's success truly rests on the time and effort sunk into those behind it, or is a result of pure luck, that's for you to decide. This wasn't really a traditional Art of Failure episode, but this was definitely a documentary.